So just to say formally, welcome to everyone to this final of our seminar series, a set of 3 that we've had as HECA's Academic Quality Enhancement Forum subgroup, where we were exploring the concepts of enhancing group work and the kinds of challenges, opportunities, and best practice that we've had. And a very big call out in praise to the head folks who are going to be presenting today. In the first part, the amazing work by Dara and Lorraine and the rest of their teams is obviously impossible to fully quantify. And we thought they would be a fantastic element to bring into the kind of final session where we talk about group work and considerations to manage that good, meaningfully. I've got good words today, so that's a good start. So thank you everyone for dialing in. Just again, for those who've joined us since I muttered it the last time, standard online etiquette, if you're not speaking, if you don't mind leaving your microphone muted, just to avoid interrupting any of the speakers. And cameras don't need to be on. If you do want to engage, the chat space is open. And obviously when we get into the Q&A sessions, we will pause recordings and people will be free to speak, and then we'll kick off the recording again for the last part. And then the recording will be posted online and we'll circulate that to all attendees subsequently. So thanks everybody. We'll get started. So just as an overview of what we've done so far with the series, this is the 3rd of the 3. We'd initially done a session back in December on why group work, where we'd looked at things like QA considerations. Joseph Ford from ICAS talked about fair means or foul, dilemmas in group assessment. And then we'd had Dr. Catherine Mulwa and Tanya Zabriskie from Hibernia and DBS respectively, speaking from an academic delivery and management perspective from their experience in the classroom and managing group work with their students. And then back in February, we had a student panel discussion, which Steve fantastically facilitated, and engaging a number of learners from a number of institutions within HECA about their experience with group work. So that was a fantastic space to give learner voice, kind of a primary space. There's always that risk of getting too in your own head around designing and developing assessment pieces and forgetting that the students are the ones who are actually engaging and dealing with it. So they're the ones to kind of keep foremost and central. And then today we're going to wrap this up with considerations around UDL, and then what I'm dubbing better group work and how we can work towards that, and the suitability for group work in different spaces. And so just in terms of what we'll be wrapping up today, obviously the welcome, housekeeping, and introductions are pretty much wrapped up, and I'm going to hand over shortly to Lorraine and Dara from AHEAD on their presentation in exploring inclusive practice and group work. If we've got time, we'll break for a small Q&A, we'll pause the recording for that, and then I'll kick back in for a kind of roundup, reflective summary piece for the series on better group work, whether divide and conquer or every chef in the kitchen, if that's a coherent notion that I've thrown out there, to wrap this whole series up. So hopefully that's going to work. And then there'll be a feedback and goodbye. For those who can hold on to the end there, we do boldly have a bit of a seminar feedback piece, if you don't mind completing a very short questionnaire just to give us feedback so we know what we're doing for the next sessions. But if you have to skedaddle at any point, it's obviously entirely understandable. It's lunchtime on a sunny day. I'm sure most people are trying to be on the beach right now rather than at their desk. And the recording will be available afterwards, so you're more than welcome to catch that at a later date. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Lorraine and Dara, if that's okay.
Great stuff, great stuff. So I will just...
Perfect. So just while you're sharing there, Ryan, I'll get kicked off, get people introduced. So my name is Dara Ryder. I'm CEO of AHEAD, and I'm here with my colleague Lorraine Gallagher. Lorraine is our information officer here in AHEAD. So she does most of the training that AHEAD would deliver on a whole range of topics around inclusive practice. We should also as well deal a lot with students around the country who are having difficulties, including with group work. Who would call into our information line for advice and support. So I suppose this session is influenced both by the literature around UDL, inclusive practice, and some more specific literature around group work and looking at students with disabilities as part of that, but also our own experience engaging with students around the place. So just in case you don't know, but AHEAD is an independent NGO focused on creating inclusive environments in education and employment for people with disabilities. So a lot of our work is focused on engaging with the further and higher education sector and professional development, working directly with students to support constructive advocacy and building community for students, and then supporting the transition as well on into the employment space. We have a whole other employment wing as well. And will we get started, Lorraine, do you think?
Yep, we get started. So
perfect. So what we're going to talk a little bit about today is we're initially going to get the frame of considering diversity in group work. So what that's really about is trying to understand, you know, why inclusive practice is important in a group work setting. So we're going to bring maybe a little bit of few specific examples in from different cohorts that we work with to sort of get the balance between how you can build flexibility into group practice but still have a coherent structure. We're going to talk a little bit about UDL, saying, you know, what is UDL and why should we actually consider it as a frame for designing group work, like why it's a useful frame for doing that. And then we're going to go into some more specific tips and strategies after that, you know, a whistle-stop tour of some of those just to bring our session together. Do you want to move along there, Lauren?
Yep.
I think I'm handing over to you.
So when we think about, like, you know, group work, and we think about our population, right? Diversity is the norm, right? And you know that from your own work, that it's not simply a case of, oh, everyone's from Dublin or everyone's Irish. There is that huge mix. And within that huge mix, we have the people that are shy, introverted, and then we have the people that are always putting their hand up, always talking, always interrupting. And it's that mixed bag and how we manage that within the actual learning environment, right? So then how do you split them into groups, right? If that side, then within that mix, we have obviously the students with disabilities. And then, you know, when you think about disability, you probably think, oh, well, you know, that's probably the person in the wheelchair or, you know, mobility issues, where in reality, you know, it's a really broad mix of people have disabilities. And for a lot of them, they're actually non-visible, right? So if you think about the fact that, you know, a lot of disabilities are non-visible, how do you make sure that they are supported within that dynamic of learning? So within that, then you've got the group work, right? So these groups of, say, autism, mental health, and say somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing, they may have real issues around the whole idea of group work because of the impact of their actual disability. So for someone with autism, right, the main thing with autism is going to be around communication, body language, interaction, right? So if they have difficulty in that area of, you know, a lot of people with autism find that group dynamic really difficult because it's very hard to read the temperature of the room. And you understand that when you think about even in terms of today and online, how do we read the temperature of how many people are on this call, right? Who's starting to feel tired? How do I mix that up? You know, and then over-reliance on communication skills, because people might actually communicate in other ways, right? The same, and autism and, say, anxiety go together because it's that, how am I going to interact? That unknown thing about going into a group, what's going to happen? Sometimes you're in a classroom situation or a learning environment where all of a sudden, Grant the tutor, you say, okay, I want everybody to break into a group. And you're like, what does that mean? I'm going to be sitting with someone I don't know, or somebody I don't particularly like, or what if the person is blind, right? They need maybe technology to interact. How are they going to interact with the group? Somebody who's deaf, maybe using an ISL interpreter. So all of these things will have, you know, create a dynamic within that group, right? Then you've got people with other things like life demands. We were talking about life demands, me and Dara, yesterday, you know, in terms of being available to be in that space. Can people be elsewhere? And also, you know, cultural differences around how they learn or where they come from in terms of going into a new environment. If you think about the diversity within the learning environment. So I'll kind of...
A lot of this is kind of as well, it kind of speaks to, we have a very singular frame for what group work actually is in higher education. We don't actually have a lot of diversity in how we consider group work. It tends to be done in pretty much the same way in a lot of different institutions in terms of how we expect students to work together in that way. And I suppose this helps us a little bit. Hopefully this session and the other work that you're doing will help you maybe to really think about that frame for group work and how you organize and design it.
Yeah, and how do you think about the fact that you do have such a diverse group of people? How do you make sure that they all fit within the model of where they sit within group work? And we'll kind of delve into that a bit more. So in terms of, just to go back to for a minute, UDL as a framework. Now we don't have time. We don't have a lot of time, me and Dara, right? So I just want to touch on the idea of UDL as a framework, right? And it splits into 3 bits, right? You've got like engagement, multiple means of engagement, right? There's always more than one way to do something, right? So thinking about like terms of engagement, I always think of that as the student voice, right? Why am I here? Why am I doing this group work? What's in it for me? Right? That's the way the student thinks. Why do I have to do this? Right? Representation is really about what are they actually studying, right? What's the material? That could be the, say, the tutor, your idea of what they're actually going to be doing in the group, right? So what are they actually doing? How is that actually being given to them? Is it all about paper format? Is it on the computer? There's so many different ways for people to actually access information, right? So more than one way to actually look at the information. And then the how is, right? Anybody here like to do cooking or knitting or any of those things? How do you know you're good at the thing, right? Well, the how is really about how you assess. That's assessment, right? So how are you assessing people? In terms of group work, do I have to be in that space all the time, or can I actually go away and come back to the group? So how are you assessing? If I decide I have autism and it's very noisy, I want to maybe go away and work in a different space and then come back. So am I still going to be assessed as part of that group, or do I actually fall down on my assessment? So considering how does that actually work within a framework? So what are you actually doing in terms of why do we do framework? That, you know, group work in terms of that group dynamic. So thinking about multiple ways of, and it doesn't have to be like loads of ways. It could be just that +1, giving people an option of being assessed in a slightly different way, but still with the same outcomes. Because you're always thinking about like standards and outcomes. What are you actually looking for in terms of the group work?
For me, I see in this, like, look, all these principles are important in the design of group work, but actually the big ones are, for me, the engagement principle here and the action and expression principle, in particular that piece around the expression principle about how people express themselves, both in the kind of formal sense in terms of your assessment design, but also between each other as group members, and is there flexibility and understanding of the different communication methods within the group as well.
Yeah.
So I suppose we need to explore why UDL is kind of a framework. First of all, UDL is an internationally recognized and evidence-based practice. So it's built on decades of research in both mostly the teaching and learning sciences, but also attaches on to a little bit of the neuroscience about how humans learn, but it's largely based in the teaching and learning sciences. So it's built on a really solid frame to consider your practice. So when you're using that as a lens, that can give you kind of confidence in terms of looking at the checkpoints of UDL and how they might align with your group work design. Yeah, so why should we use it in a kind of in the more prosaic way? We can think about it as supporting proactive inclusive design of group work. So, you know, a lot of the things we think about when we think about inclusive practice are those kind of retroactive steps. Oh, this one student can't do this group work for X reason, so I'm going to make this singular accommodation for this student. And that's important, and there will always be elements of students that require that kind of individual accommodation. But actually UDL supports us to proactively build more flexible approaches to group work right from the off, so that people don't actually have to single themselves out in that way as much, or at least we have a reduced need for those individual accommodations.
So an example, so what I was saying about the person with autism is not just saying to that person with autism, oh, well, yeah, you can go off and come back. It's giving people a little bit of flexibility about how they actually engage with it. So in other words, what's really important about that piece of group work?
Yeah, and structuring and scaffolding the group work design so that you know, it does, so that groups actually have a frame for discussing how they can work in a different way to kind of meet the needs of the entire group. And it can support students to understand why group work is important. This is one of the fundamental things we see every day in our colleges. Most students hate group work, right? We all know that from our interaction. And the reason they hate it is because working in groups is difficult. We all know this from our working lives. You know, there's always going to be people that will rub up against and all of those things. So really helping students to understand why you're making them do this, you know, giving them the bigger picture of how it connects to their professional practice, how it connects to other things, and we'll explore that later. It can support groups to develop roles and agreements that work for them. So really it's about giving, this part is about giving groups agency in how they work together. you know, so that they have a hand, and we're not just being told this is what you're doing as a group, this is how you're going to do it. They have some agency and flex in how they work together and how they go about achieving the goals of the assessment. So I think we're going to get into more specifics now. Yeah,
Yeah,
move on.
Yeah.
There's a whistle-stop tour of tips. So we've just pulled out some really key tips as we see it from UDL practice that can help us to address group work pieces. One is around the complexity of group work, and in particular, I think the stakes of it. You know, it's really not fair to our students to bring them from a secondary school setting where maybe the reliance on group work is, you know, is very low. There's not a lot happening in that zone. Especially in a kind of high stakes setting where it actually they have a mark that matters. So it's really important to introduce them over time to those higher stakes pieces. So when you're looking at your assessment, you're looking at the stakes that it's actually involved with. Do we really need to be actually marking people in group work in their first semester or their first year? Would it be better for us to be able to scaffold that and introduce it over time so that they begin to understand the dynamics of group work, and they begin to understand, I suppose, build strategies for how to get the best out of group work themselves over time. So we can move that thing of over time, just increasing the stakes, increasing the complexity of the group projects. I know that's not always easy because sometimes we're being asked to come in and we're delivering one module in 1 year, but if there's possibility of engaging at a programmatic level in this kind of dialogue about where the assessment sits and what form of assessments take place in each parts of your program, that's a really good way to support our students, because basically what we're saying is we're not throwing you in the deep end straight away. We're bringing you into the shallow end here, and we're going to sort of help you to swim up the pool gently in that way. Move along there, Lauren.
Yep. So, you know, that's back to that thing with Dara, like people don't understand and they don't like it. Oh, I'm not doing that. And actually framing why it matters to them. What are they going to get from this? Back to the, you know, engagement piece, back to that student voice and understanding where does that fit into what I'm doing? Why am I doing it? I'm doing a course to do with accounts. Why am I doing group work? You know, is it really relevant to me? So, you know, so that like in terms of, you know, they're out in maybe field-based scenarios or thinking about actually in work. When you're in work, no matter what your job is, you have to interact with people in some way. And for projects, you get involved in projects and that involves group work. So, you know, kind of explaining it in that way as well, and asking and the student voice is so important. Asking them about, will that matter to them? Where do they see themselves fitting within that framework? So actually, always when you think about things, always thinking about actually talking to the students, because that's one thing they always talk about is, oh, they never engage with us, they never ask us, they just make us do it, you know, and thinking about actually ways to make it better as well. You know,
I can see Jane has put into the chat there that prescriptive group work, in other words, telling our students how and when they participate, really defeats the purpose of group work as a process and what we're preparing them to do in the real world. So I love Grant's comment here. Grant is saying he forgot that he volunteered to be an icon in the graphic. I swear, Grant, we didn't ask the illustrator to draw you directly, but that was just a coincidence. But come here, while we're doing this, actually, people might put in themselves into the chat why they think group work matters for your field. It'd be really interesting to hear those thoughts, and we might come back around towards the end of the session.
Later on, So you know, actually sharing, and the thing about students is we've done a lot of work with students, and they love to hear your examples, real life examples that will feed into them working as a group, right? You know, because remember, you're the more knowledgeable person and they're in the learning space, right? And talking about, you know, what does collaboration actually mean? The time, the space, the communication methods are really important for lots of people for lots of different reasons. And remember, a lot of your students will have English as a second language, right? So when we talk about UDL, we're talking about inclusion of everybody, right? So within that space, you've got students with disabilities, you've got mature students, you've got people with English as a second or third language. So, you know, all of these things will play into the idea of the group work and getting them to reflect on how are they going to do things, what's really important to them, right? The values of a group, getting them to come up with their, and it sounds a bit like, you know, oh, something you do in school, but getting them to come up with their own rules around how they're going to work as a group, problem solving, what's going to happen if things don't work out, right? Do they have, can they go to you? What do they do in terms of if things are not working out? You know, the thing about group work, oh, well, you know, Bob, he doesn't do anything, you know, so kind of managing that as well. And also as well, this thing about tools, right? Tools are brilliant, right? Do students know about where to find the tools? Things like technology. We were just talking today before tiling on PowerPoint on my computer, right? These things are really handy, right? There's loads of things in the computer that can help students to get the most out of their learning, you know, individually and within a group. Do students know where to do it, how to do it, how to switch it on? Read aloud software, right? Voice input software. All these tools are really helpful tools. Do you use templates?
I love to reflect on this one, actually, to think about it. What does collaboration mean? And even in the experience that we've all gone through over the last number of years with COVID, like even think about how we think about collaboration so differently 3 years ago than we would have now. So that's what we need to do. We need to open our minds, our students' minds up, and help them to understand that everybody in the class is going to have a different way that works for them, and that they need to discuss this and come to some agreement about that.
And also even things, simple things like, you know, like say Google Docs. I don't know what system, you know, everyone's using, but even like things like sharing a document, that they can all share around one document and I'll add to one document. Do they even know how to do that? Is that, you know, is that a tool they could use? So kind of like those, and those are things that became really important, as Dara said, over COVID. We started discovering all these things, you know, that maybe we hadn't thought about before. Well, maybe in ahead we thought about it, but you know.
I'm just looking at time there, Laura. I think we need to push on.
Yep. Okay, quick. So obviously we talked about this before. Roles. What's actually going to happen? Clear roles. That's really important. When is it going to be done? Right. The milestones, the timeline, breaking it into chunks. Right. You have to have this done by a time so that it gets done within a time frame. How are we going to communicate? Allowing for people's different communication needs. Boundary management. That's always very important within a group, and you know, who's managing that, right? And as I said, what happens if problems arise? And then grading. This is really, really important, is people often don't know how are the marks allocated, right? So that's something that needs to be, is it as a group or is it individually, or is it a combination of a few different ways, right? So that's really important.
Yeah,
right?
so I think on the grading rule, this is absolutely clear. For me, this is one of the most important parts of group work, right, in terms of helping. First of all, we mentioned previously in terms of how students work together on the last slide. You know, one thing that we find a lot with students with particular types of disabilities, autistic students would be a great example, is that we have a real need to make the things that we consider implicit explicit. So we need to make a real effort to help groups to do that together. So things that we might think of in a group collaboration as, you know, maybe we read body language and things like that. We pick up our cues from all of those things. But actually getting the groups, just from the last side, getting the groups into actually making a formal commitment to each other and having that discussion in the early days. It's, first of all, it sends a real signal to everyone in the groups that we're open for business for different types of work. And it kind of binds them together on a baseline collective agreement. Now with this is the sort of, this is the tutor side of the making the implicit explicit. Get very, very clear with your grading. Are you grading them as an entire group? Are you grading them as an individual? Or are you grading them as both? Often what's really nice with group work to do is a staged approach. So for example, maybe they have to do an assignment to build an advertising campaign, and you have a two-stage approach where firstly they submit their ideas as an individual, and then the groups are put together where those ideas are then discussed and then brought, and the campaign is, you know, they make decisions and they record how those decisions are making. They make the collective campaign. So there's an element of both there which provides clarity for each. And which aspects of the output have the most value in the group work. So be really, really clear with your rubric so that all your students understand, this is what I am going to mark you on. This is what I want you to show up for most within the group exercise. And then one that I always like to put in, the bomb that I always like to drop at the end is, do we actually need to grade it all? A huge amount of the issues that we come up with within group work are actually to do with the variances in grading. You know, I would have gotten a B, only Billy over there was falling asleep within the group. And, you know, increasingly I'm getting frustrated at, you know, this model of grading that we're in, even though we're largely in, from a quality perspective, we're largely in a standards-based system, that we're still insisting on doing this kind of incremental grading system and relying on that. So is there a way that we consider within those group work settings, maybe it's a standards-based approach? This is the baseline for completion of the assignment. If the group completes that assignment, then they get the grades, you know, and really that sort of reflects more what happens in real life. We all know none of us have probably ever been in a group where there's actually been equitable distribution of tasks and things like that. So we need to recognize that as well. I think we're probably just coming to time. There's a few really nice comments in the chat there. Do you want to take a few of those, Lorraine?
You know, I actually because I have the two screens
Yeah,
going.
no problem here. Yeah, I'll tell you, I'll grab a few here. Well, first of all, a few people have been reflecting on why group work is important to them in their own context, in their own fields, and more generally. So Maria said there that group work teaches you great teamwork and skills for the workplace. So she's seen it as a kind of core life skill. And I think Jonathan is chiming in and they're kind of agreeing with that. Group is a life and work skill, builds organizational and time management skills and understanding of other perspectives. And then Finbar is asking a really interesting question there. He's saying, is there a need for a learner to declare a condition within the group? And take that, Lauren.
I think it depends, right? So it would depend on what their needs are, and it depends on the type of group, right? So obviously, if somebody is hard of hearing or deaf, they need certain things to happen within a group. If it's if they're all sitting together, there's a communication need, and maybe the same for somebody with autism. But you have to respect the fact that some people will not want to disclose to the group for various reasons, right? Because there may be a fear around, oh, if I disclose, they're going to think I'm not as good as them. That, you know, so you have to be mindful of the person, you know, particularly if somebody's blind as well, they may have certain needs but have to be addressed within the group. So, or it might be obvious if somebody's blind or, you know, has a disability, but given that a lot of disabilities are non-visible, a lot of people will not want to disclose. And that's where UDL comes in, right? If things are properly structured, the need for disclosure in actual fact should be less. Now we don't have time to kind of go into that in much more detail now, but it is about structuring stuff so that, you know, there's less need for that.
That's it. You try to build in more accessibility and more flexibility in the group work design, you know, so that people can bring more of themselves into the group work, you know, and not have to bend to the group work, you know, have the group work bend to them a little bit, if that makes sense. And the other thing I'd say is that what's really good for educators is to flag that piece around, look, this is what's happening, this is the group work. But if we do need, you know, that we understand there's variability and diversity within the classroom, come and speak to me privately if you'd like to have a chat about how, you know, your concerns about this group work setting for you. So just sending the message out there that you're open to discussing that, because reasonable accommodations will be required for some individuals. That's just always going to be a case. And I suppose you may sometimes come up against a piece where you're actually considering, is this group work essential to the learning outcomes of this course? And is there an accommodation that I can make for an individual where, like, you know, group work may be extremely difficult for some individuals. So you might have to have a real think about that in relation to your learning outcomes, and to see where there is flex for individual accommodations too.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm conscious of time, Grant. Do you want us to wrap up, or should we address some of those other comments in the chat?
I mean, you're welcome to pick up a couple more of the comments if you're happy to. Got a good couple of 5 minutes.
Perfect. Lauren, you might move on to the resources slide as well there, so people can see some resources. And we'll go through.
So there's loads of resources here.
Yeah, so there's loads. Just to go through a few of those before we pick up on the last comment. So the UDL for FET Resource Hub is a whole resource hub about UDL, has loads of case studies of UDL in practice in the FET setting, but actually they're all really applicable to HE settings too. And we have ARC, which is our free inclusive practice short courses hub. So there's one on an intro to UDL there, but there's also really good stuff around digital accessibility and around like laying out your course homepages to support executive function, which would be a big thing for a lot of our disabled learners. There's the CAST UDL guidelines we've linked to directly, and actually a lot of this, some of the thinking that we've drawn on here was drawn from the work of an educator called Robin Spring, and so there's two pieces there linked. One is 15 Steps to Group Project Success, which is a free module that sort of talks about a UDL approach, and there's a podcast with Robin as well there, Think UDL podcast, if you want to quickly dive in and get some tips on that. I love Yvonne's comment in the chat here saying we have very interesting aha moments re group work in our MA in education here in Griffith College. The students and lecturers and industry learning and development professionals, they find themselves with the shoe on the other foot. They are now in a, I love that. That's brilliant. When educators realize the constraints on them in a group work setting, it feels very different, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And Terry's just talking there as well about her saying in terms of the importance of group work is that it helps participants to understand better from other group work members, and that she learns best from other people's questions. And that's the kind of questions that she didn't think of. And she feels very much less vulnerable or more comfortable in my vulnerability if it's shared, which I just think is a lovely frame for thinking about that. And all those kind of UDL tips, I think, help us to do that. You know, they help us to set the tone for a group work collaboration where it's okay to share those kinds of things, and it's okay to say, actually, this doesn't really work for me in this way. Can we come to a compromise here? We won't eat up any more of your time, I think, Grant. There's a few more really interesting comments in the chat, but we'll wrap it up there and hand back over to you.
No, that sounds great. What I might suggest is, unless there are any burning questions in the group, in kind of among folks, if you want to put your hands up, we can pause the recording and kind of give space for a bit of a conversation around those. But if there's no burning questions and you're happy to hold on till the end there, I think either Lorraine or Dara might still be with us towards the end of this, and I'll try and give us space at the end to wrap up. So if there's no hands up, I don't know, Jean, is that a hand up or is that just an icon? No, that's my icon, never mind. I'm not seeing hands up, so I'm assuming we're okay to jump ahead.
Just to say, I'm going to have to run, folks. So, but I really enjoyed meeting you all today and working with you. So if you know, our contacts are all on the slides. So if you need to follow up with a question even afterwards, feel free to do that.
Thanks,
and I'll hang on.
Perfect. Thank you, Lorraine. So thanks, folks. We'll ideally, if I can get through, if I can keep on time, have a bit of space for a Q&A at the end of this. But what I was going to move to, following the kind of UDL and inclusive practice piece, was try and wrap up the kind of trend or the findings or the kind of key points that keep recurring through on the seminar series as a whole. So just to check, everyone can see a slide at the moment? Still checking that before I launch ahead. Nods, yes, I'm seeing a thumbs up. That's a good sign. Perfect. So I'll let you know when I jump a screen, and if nothing's changed, do let me know. But so I didn't actually introduce myself at the start. So my name is Grant Goodwin, Assistant Registrar at Dublin Business School, and currently co-chairing the HAQEF group, hence my presence today. So what we've done with the series is, as mentioned earlier, we'd had the 3 sessions of which this is the 3rd. The December one, we had the designing, deploying group work, so QA considerations in terms of actually managing, preparing, and facilitating group work. Then Joseph Ford from ICAS presented on fair means or foul, dilemmas in group assessment, with kind of a strong focus on the psychological and the kind of interhuman elements of it and the challenges therein. And then from Dr. Catherine Mulwer from Hibernia and Dr. Tanya Zabriskie from DBS, we had the academic faculty experience of delivering and managing group work, both in blended learning environments and in the increasingly international and digital world that is higher education, which Lorraine and Dara have already referred to as it is something we're seeing. We're seeing more diverse class groups, and we're seeing more diverse modes, which is quite an interesting set of challenges to add to group work. It's no longer just funneling a group of very similar students in the corner of a room, if ever such a thing really happened. But it's getting more and more diverse and complicated in that sense. Then in February, we had our learner panel where there was some really interesting conversation and experience shared from learners from a number of colleges in their experience of group work and kind of where it did work and where it doesn't work, and kind of the key pieces that they found resonated a fair bit with what we'd already covered. And then I think a good few of the points raised by Lorraine and Dara this morning echoed back to what they'd had. Kind of issues did arise around lack of structuring, lack of communication channels and escalation points, and mechanisms to deal with that, and diversity between groups in terms of extroverts and introverts and kind of the loudness of the voice in the room. So those were factors that kind of came through on the learner panel. And then obviously We just had this, so I shan't go over Ahead's talk there. That's not moving across yet. Has that moved a slide? People seeing something new or waiting for some indication in the room? Yes, okay, I'm seeing. Thanks, Alexandra. So I suppose in terms of wrapping up the kind of series as a whole and the considerations of group work that we've explored, it does feel like it pushes us back to the original question of what is the purpose of education and assessment as a whole? Why are we assessing? And that was a point Darren and Lorraine made a few times, is what's the purpose of it? Don't deploy, there's no purpose or value in deploying group work for the sake of having group work listed on your assessment strategy. What's it for is kind of supposed to be the first question. And so I've stolen National Forum's infographic regarding assessment of learning as learning and for learning. And obviously there's value in all of those, but there's also pros and cons in all of those. And the deployment of any assessment strategy is always going to depend on the subject area and the level and the intent of it as well. So it does feel a lot of the time like group work is best positioned as more as learning and for learning. It's something that helps foster kind of a skill set in learners, and then being able to assess that itself, the outputs and the process of that, that's a fantastic piece for our side, the QA administrator side, and the faculty putting a stamp on a parchment at the end of the day. But nevertheless, it's supposed to be, well, you know, we'd expect to look towards a student-centered position where we are trying to embed a culture of practice and a skill set among learners for what is going to be the workplace or the real world, I'll quote it, so that they can proceed with that. So that is the first question, is what is the assessment for? And then also, what is the education for? Is it simply to be ready for a job, or is it something more broad around socialization and kind of skill set for the larger world that is outside of the, we'll call it the ivory tower, although I don't know if it's been an ivory tower for quite a while. And I think one of the key pieces from the conversation around inclusive practice is not simply designing and deploying group work as well through inclusive practices, but it's also kind of embedding inclusive practice for learners. It's role modeling that. Group work does entail a lot more learner-learner interaction than a traditional individual assessment. It's not quite student faces lecturer, submits something and has to kind of navigate the relationship that is. It is inherently a task that has learners working with each other. And if they're seeing clear guidelines on how to engage inclusively from their lecturers, and they've kind of got ideas of how to engage with each other, as Lorraine and Dara said, there needs to be clarity on how they deal with each other, and setting role modeling inclusive practice, both in the assessment design, but also in kind of supporting and scaffolding learners into how best to approach group work. One would hope that the benefit from this is that we embed a culture of inclusive practice that students will take beyond this assessment. They'll take out into the larger world and into the further things that they're going to do in groups. Which again links it back to being an authentic assessment, although not every discipline is necessarily going to be group work heavy. Everyone sooner or later is going to encounter a group scenario. So a lot of jobs do have very group heavy roles, but you've also got other forms of groups that form out there, homeowners associations. Activism and kind of social justice movements are other forms of groups that aren't going to be directly workplace attributable. Lovely transferable skills if we want to focus on those as a notion, but these are life skills as much as they are kind of workplace readiness skills. And I think there's that value in seeing what group work can foster broadly, as well as for the specific graduate attributes and the learning outcomes for the module. So it's kind of having that lens is valuable, and if that culture of inclusive practice can extend beyond simply managing a group, then that should hopefully filter down onwards beyond that. And that's that socialization piece about education that I think is a very valuable one to remember. And yes, the greater balance of learner-learner relationships in a group work than we traditionally have seen, well, we not traditionally, than in an individual assessment or an exam or an MCQ. And then one of the other points touched on briefly by Lorraine and Darrett was that not every story is a success story. And I think there's some value in remembering that there are pitfalls, there are things that don't work. groups are different. So the strategy that works for one won't work for another. I think it's valuable for faculty and administrators to remember that in terms of design and deploying. Having a one-size-fits-all approach rarely works, but it's also as worthwhile for role modeling for learners that, just because I can approach this group in this manner doesn't mean that approach will work for every other group. I think there's valuable lessons to be drawn from research and science where unsuccessful research is as valuable to publish so that others are aware that that's an unsuccessful trajectory. Don't waste your time on it. You can go and do more advanced things. There's that reticence in some cases where there's such a strong emphasis on publishing success that we hide away, or we kind of don't make a big show of unsuccessful research outputs, but those are actually so useful so that we don't waste, the collective doesn't waste time pursuing pathways that have already been tried and tested. So I think there is some value in both role modeling that not everything will be a success, and there's ways to deal with lack of success or an unsuccessful venture. It is a mature approach to do, so that's another element of group work. You are going to encounter difficulty and challenges that didn't succeed, but there are pathways around that. So role modeling that and then also setting that out for learners. It also mitigates a little bit of the anxiety that comes with assessment. It doesn't always have to work, and it sucks when it doesn't work, but don't beat yourself up necessarily about it if it doesn't. So I think there's some key valuables about the kind of culture of group work that can be filtered down and embedded through learners there. And then I think it's a standing point for Lorraine and Dara and HED as a whole is every learner benefits from inclusive practice and group work. Well, inclusive practice specifically in group work, but in everything. All the suggestions for group work practice kind of carry across broadly for every learner and often in most other assessments. So I've stolen their quote from their website about there being no typical or average learner, a variety of learning styles and methods, and we have to introduce that greater flexibility into the teaching and learning practice. So as Darren and Lorraine walked through, things like starting formative and being heavy on feedback and scaffolding is really critical. That's true. We find that across the general design of assessment, but group work especially. Communication modes, especially now that you've got more learner-mediated relationships. Grading practices and the clarity around that, the transparency in rubrics is a critical piece that extends to every learner. And then setting boundaries as well. I suppose, again, managing the fact that it's group, it is different from an individual assessment. No lecturer wants a 3 a.m. email asking for immediate help and then would reasonably be upset that they hadn't responded by 5 a.m. That's a kind of boundary in one sense, but you've also got to manage or role model or set a charter for learners to understand the boundaries that they've got on each other. As Lorraine pointed out, you've got a diversity of kind of learner profiles or learner identities and needs in a group, some of which are not visible, and people do need to be able to have the space of drawing boundaries. Yeah, that's great that some of you can go and meet up after class and spend another 3 hours talking about an assessment plan that we've got a project to build towards. I've got kids, I need to get home. You've got elements like that that need to be kind of set and discussed with groups, and a little bit of guidance. That's the skill we're designing towards, is that, or striving to design towards, is that learners need to, or graduates ideally, will have the skill set to manage those boundaries and deal with them as well, which links again to timelines. And then the fun one with roles is obviously, you've got this diversity of approach. You've got very strict setting of roles and functions, which has the challenges, obviously, of restricting learner flexibility and choice. And as you say, I think it was Jean's comment, defeats the purpose of group work to a degree, but sometimes that structure is helpful for some groups. And so it's a bit of a balance. It depends on the learner profile. It depends on the assessment type. But these are all factors that need to be actively considered rather than just slapped into an approach and moved on without further thinking. So these are all very valuable learnings from inclusive practice principles that can extend to group work, but also beyond them. And so to the question that I've thrown out there, what is better, dividing and conquering, or should every chef in the kitchen go at it? With UDL principles, dividing and conquering, it recognizes that everyone brings something different to the table. Those are different strengths. also different weaknesses, but that's kind of the benefit of group work, is that you can kind of lean more on a strength for one person where another person might not have that, and drawing on that and relying on that's fantastic. But that does have to be managed. It has to be informed and guided. It has to be scaffolded and should be role modeled with open channels of communication available. Short of that, it does risks an unsuccessful story, but not in a meaningful, helpful way, more in a frustration for everybody kind of way. And there is also necessarily that issue of equity and management of different learner expectations. If it becomes assessment of learning, and what we're looking for is who did what to show that they know things, it does get a bit tricky to determine individual contributions to different pieces, and making sure that everyone who gets the same parchment at the end of the day, does that mean the same thing for everyone? That's a challenge for academics. It's a challenge for quality assurance. So that's one to navigate quite carefully as well. The every chef approach has some kind of some benefits as well. If everyone gets assigned a task or a role, or gets relegated to one by the louder members in the group, you've obviously got a problem there. If you never had the opportunity to expand into new areas or discover that you've actually got a strength that you hadn't dipped into before. So there's some benefits with kind of getting a full chance to have a swipe at it. But group work, interestingly, is not intended to be competitive. I think that's where Dara's point about the kind of fine-tuned, well, it's associated with Dara's point about the fine-tuned grading practices, is it can kind of foster a bit of an aggressive competition of, I want to be that 5% ahead, I want to be in the top leaderboard, where the learning space probably doesn't necessarily benefit the best from a highly competitive strategy. I'll put my hands up. I also know that I need a bit of competition, otherwise I will be lazy and aim for passing mark. But if the competition overweighs the learning process, we're stepping away from the values that is to be derived from these assessments and from education as a whole. And I'm conscious of time. So a couple of elements to deal with, and Lorraine and Dara would have mentioned variants of this, is quality assurance and group work is you're working with a spectrum. And I suppose that's increasingly becoming a factor. The formality of a group formation, is it a loosely grouped number of students who've kind of sat in the same corner of the room? Or are you dealing with strongly structured, you're going to be the project manager, you're going to be the report writer, you're going to do these tasks? That will range, and it'll sometimes depend on how you set it, but it will lead to fluctuations in the actual assessment process itself. Learner prior experience, links with culture and values, those are the backgrounds people are coming from. If you've got a mixed class of cultures and languages and value systems, this is a bit that Joseph Ford touched on, individualist versus collective cultures. You've got different styles and approaches there. You've got introverts, you've got extroverts, you've got people who've been working in industry, who've been leading group work events through project management for years. And then you've got high school leavers who are coming out and encountering this for the first time, or people coming back into education from less formalized systems. It's a diversity of experience, and there's strengths to draw on, but there's weaknesses that people will be anxious about, and those need to be managed as well. Confidence becomes a big factor there. Then there's the more technical one, well, the more traditional ones of learner writing skills. There'll be a diversity there, and you kind of want to foster it, but not also weaken it, a kind of final submission based on it. Learner motivation, we encountered the concept of free riders and loafers. I think there's social loafers in the first session, where some people, if they see that others are going to do the work, are quite happy to step back and let that happen. That's where you start getting a bit tricky about how you assess who's actually contributed to the work. And you obviously don't want to discourage freeloading or social loafing and free riding. And you don't want to have the burden all sitting on one individual to manage the entire group project, because that's a dissatisfaction on their side as well. So you've got all of these things, and then level of digital interaction. I think Lorraine and Dara, you'd already mentioned it. We've had massive transformations in how we've dealt with collaborative work in professional contexts since COVID. Working Google Docs or SharePoint or OneDrive is a radical change to how we at least used to do it. And I know learners are engaging with things like Google Docs to work on things, or collaborative things. Hibernier's got that amazing cohort connect process where they can interlink with each other. Great tools, and the tools are important, but it's also kind of how confident people are to use them and engage them, or be aware of them. So signposting, that helps. Design and management, I think we found from across the sessions does tend to be the kind of critical piece to cover off there. So forgive the metaphor of a lot of bricks falling off the crane there towards the building structure. We know assessment needs to be authentic. We value those transferable skills, and there's the importance of socialization and being able to embed a culture of inclusive practice, but also collaborative practice across the way. And it's dealing with the learning community. Those are all factors to aim towards and develop, while also keeping an eye on learning outcome alignment, transparency around grading practices. Monitoring progress is an important feature, especially when it comes to learning assessment. And then group allocation and what's necessary for the level, the profile of learners and such. The one broken brick I've thrown in the corner there is the myth that group work is less work for the academic because they've got fewer units to mark. I think there's some value in flagging that in reality, the practice will be that there should be as much work going into the facilitation and support for learners through the group work process, that you're not getting away with less work, fewer units to mark at the end. It is just that the work is deployed elsewhere. And I think that's an important one because we've seen cases where people have thought, well, if I throw this into a group work piece, I'll have less to do at the end and it's not as daunting. Well, consider it. So for learners, kind of what we picked up across a number of the sessions was the kind of role group dynamics has to play. It's those introverts, those extroverts, the loud voices, the silent voices. The learners, especially in their session, talked about the kind of confidence to engage in the room and being kind of overridden or dominated by particular voices. So managing that, one of the values recommended by one of the lecturers was setting out learner charters early on so people know what the spaces are, what's expected, what's appropriate, setting those boundaries, and that can wrap into the timelines and the capacity like that. The collaborative tools are obviously going to be an important factor. So those will pull in, and then that's where we start veering into where technology plays and doesn't play. So ChatGPT and other artificial text generating software, those can be used in some spaces, but obviously there's the line to draw between collaborative use and collegiate activity and springboards versus over-reliance and managing the academic integrity in that sense. Where does the responsibility lie if one member goes a bit rogue with something dubious? How does that assessment strategy get dealt with? Do the rest of the team, are they supposed to hold a member accountable, or is it an individual piece that can be kind of teased apart? These are challenges that kind of come out of the woodwork, which you hope you never have to deal with, and quality teams never want to have to kind of drill down into, but unfortunately do need a bit of consideration about how this should be managed if it arises. And then where there's reflections, which is often pulled in for assessment of learning, where you're trying to identify individual components, there's value in that for the assessment of learning, but hopefully also as and for learning, where the metacognition comes in. You're making learners a bit reflective of their learning process, their group dynamic engagement, and how they fit in with that. And there's value to be derived from those. So a lot of the learners were quite positive about the experience of practicing group dynamics and management. But that learning of learning is a fantastic opportunity, but it is also something that needs to kind of get structured correctly. Otherwise, it might veer off into a meaningless tick box ticking exercise. There's my words. And then as a final bit, kind of the group consciousness. So touching back onto what Joseph Ford covered was the self-orientation versus collectivity orientation, dealing with people's psychology. Are they more individualist or are they more collectivist? Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions sees Ireland as quite an individualist culture, but you're dealing with other cultures in the classroom who aren't necessarily. And there's also conflict avoidance. If something goes wrong, how will a group manage that? Do you shut down and hunker down and just pretend it's not happening? Do you go and seek help? Do you get antagonistic? Those are group dynamics that all kind of need to get managed, and that's valuable in the process. But the kind of role modeling and the charter setting for where people need to go with those are going to be important elements, because there is inappropriate ways to deal with things, but that kind of needs to be set out at an early stage so people learn how to do it. And then when there is perceptions of the group engagement, where you've got perceptions of contributions from others who are deemed weak links, there's kind of an antagonism that can be fostered, which obviously is a problem. But it can also turn internally. If someone feels that they're the weak link, that they're letting the team down, that self-perception of a weakness is an anxiety-producing element, which isn't great for the learner, obviously. So setting kind of supports and structures and facilitating and scaffolding learners to deal with those components are all things to be thought about around group work, and managing that kind of process. They're all fantastic skills and necessary skills for the workplace and the larger world, but how do we scaffold and form learners into being experienced or ready with those skills to deal with them? And from a learner session, one of the key things that echoed research into it is there is a preference among learners for group learning rather than group assessment. Dara and Lorraine's slides about starting early with formative and low stakes and building up to summative and high stakes kind of reflects that. Like the group learning, you need to know how to do it first before you want to focus on just the project at the end of the day. And so there is something about that group learning process to start with, and then building up to a group assessment kind of approach, something to think about in program design. I'm very conscious of time. So just as a summary there, divide and conquer, I think largely is quite a useful one. It's the practice that most of us would do. I'll do section A, you do section B, you do section C, we'll pull them all together. It's more manageable for learners if they've got their roles and expectations and requirements kind of identified and set out in advance, rather than just plowing ahead and then everyone's dissatisfied. But then comes the question of how does grading recognize those differences? And then online platforms thankfully offer more opportunities. But where do you have your individual competitor if they're seeing someone as a weak link or seeing themselves as a weak link? Does the piece come together as a coherent unit at the end? And how do you manage the extroverts or the loud voices or the culturally aligned to be kind of assertive people alongside others in the classroom? So those are all factors that need to be played with. I think it would be difficult to say that any one is better than another. It'll depend on the learner profiles. It'll depend on the assessment and its goals. But they're all factors to take into mind, and a one-size-fits-all approach is probably a bit of a risky one across the board. I'm very conscious of time, so apologies for that. The final question being why group work? It is authentic assessment, but is it authentic for every workplace setting? It'll be necessary for life, but is it for every career? I think there are some careers that are less group worky. So if you're designing for specific graduate attributes, is it aligned to where you're going for? And then you obviously build on the scaffolding and support, and then consider the questions of assessment as for and of learning. Who and what is being assessed in the end? So we are very much at the end of the time. Apologies for that. But there is a feedback link in there if folks do have a chance to do that. And what we might do is pause for, sorry, I'm trying to get my chat up. There's a direct link to the, nope, that didn't do what I wanted it to do. Sorry. We'll pause we'll stop the recording actually, if that's okay. And if anyone does have any questions, that'll be great. And I am trying to see if I can get that form up for everyone so that that is accessible. But Steve, if I might ask if you don't mind ending the recording, and we might open up for any questions.